Viewers at home, you are welcome to my presentation on trial balance. Trial balance. In this presentation, I will examine the meaning of trial balance, steps or rules for extracting the trial balance, and I will also solve questions, exam questions. Exam question will be solved. If you are just coming across this YouTube channel for the first time, or if you have not subscribed in the past, please don't forget to click the red subscribe button and also turn on the notification bell icon so that you don't miss my upcoming videos. If you are a returning subscriber, I say thank you and God bless you. What do we mean by trial balance? Trial balance is the list of debit and credit balances extracted from the ledgers. Trial balance. This is the list of debit and credit balances extracted from the ledgers. The list of debit and credit balances extracted from the ledgers is said to be the trial balance. By the time you post your transactions to ledger in line with the debit entry, in line with the principles of double entry, the debit balance in the ledger, you post them to the debit side of the trial balance. And the credit balance or credit balances in the ledger, you post them to the credit side of the trial balance. That list is what we call the trial balance. After you have posted your debit balances and credit balances from the ledger to trial balance, the debit side of the trial balance must agree with the credit side of the trial balance, where your transactions have been posted in line with the principles of double entry. We should find that for every debit entry, there must be a corresponding credit entry and vice versa. So, now, why extracting the trial balance? Purpose of trial balance or reasons for extracting the trial balance. Number one, or the primary purpose or primary reason for extracting a trial balance is to prove the arithmetic accuracy of the ledgers. To prove the arithmetic accuracy of the ledgers. Number two, it facilitates the preparation of final accounts. Two, it reveals the errors in the ledgers. It reveals the errors in the ledgers. That is, it shows where the postings are not in line with the double entry. Those errors that affect the agreement of trial balance, the difference will be disclosed in the trial balance. So these are the reasons for extracting a trial balance. So what are the rules for extracting a trial balance? Rules for extracting a trial balance. Rules for extracting a trial balance. Where you are extracting your trial balance from the ledgers. Debit balance in the ledger, in the ledger or ledgers, takes a debit entry in the trial balance. Trial balance. Why credit balances? Credit balance in the ledger takes a credit entry in the trial balance. Other rules I'm going to examine is we debit assets and expenses where ledger balances are given. Where ledger balances are given, balances are given. You debit assets and expenses. Assets and expenses, you debit them in the trial balance. Then liabilities, income and capital, you credit them in the trial balance. Now, I want to start with the assets. What are assets? The definition I'm given now is for the beginners. Maybe somebody who is just learning the account, so that they'll be able to understand. Assets, any properties that belong to the business are said to be the business asset. I'm not giving the definition in accordance with the IASB conceptual framework. Any properties of the business or any resources or properties that belong to the business, we regard them as an asset to the business. Remember, I told you that assets takes a debit entry. Examples of assets are land and building. Land and building could be a property to the business. Plants and machinery could be a property of the business. Motor vehicles could be a property to the business. Furniture and fittings. All these are properties of the business. I've told you that any assets at all, I said they should be debited. Then we have inventories or stocks. That is your stocks. The inventories of the business are assets to the business. Trade receivables or trade debtors. People that are owing the business. That means the properties of the business is in their hands. In that case, they could be regarded as an asset to the business. Cash in hands. cash the business have at hands, or cash of the business which the owner have at hands, are assets to the business. Cash at bank, the money the business has at the bank or have at the bank is an asset to the business. Prepaid expenses. So, expenses paid in advance. That means the period in which these expenses ought to have been paid have not yet due, but the business paid it in advance. That means the service have not been enjoyed, but they have paid for it. It's an asset to the business. Accrued income. Accrued income is an asset. I said all assets. I said they should be debited to the trial balance. The second entry I said that needs a debit entry in the trial balance is an expenses. I've told you that expenses should be debited. Assets and expenses should be debited. What are the examples of expenses? Expenses include salaries and wages, rent and rates. Rent and rates, and lighting and heating. The money spent for certain thing, or the money the business incur on certain items which are not an asset could be regarded as an expenses. Lighting and heating. If they pay for insurance, if they pay for carriage outwards, if they pay for carrying the goods to customers, if they pay for carrying the goods from the place of purchase to their warehouse, that is carriage inwards, is an expense. The money expended by the business for certain items which are not an asset to them, are not for the payment of liabilities, we regard them as an expenses. Carriage outwards. Depreciation. All these items are regarded as an expense of the business. Transport expenses. Then, aside the transport, then we have other expenses, miscellaneous expenses, or general expenses. Directors' remuneration. Advertising. Salesman commission. These are the money expended on certain items. Factory overheads. etc. I've told you that all expenses should be debited. Assets and expenses, I said they should be debited. Now, at the credit side, I said liability, income, or gain, or profit. I said this item should be credited. Then as well as the capital. This item should be credited. What are liabilities? Liabilities are the debt owed by the business. Remember, I told you that I'm not giving you the definition in accordance with the IASB conceptual framework. That is, if you want to learn further, go and watch my presentation on IAS 1, presentations of financial statement. If you want to know the meaning of each of those elements in accordance with the IASB conceptual framework. The debt owed by the business are said to be liabilities. Remember, I told you that these items should be credited. Liabilities include payables, which are also known as creditors. Accrued expenses. Accrued expenses, bank overdraft. These are debts owed by the business. Bills, payables. These payables are all liabilities. Loans of the business. All these are liabilities. Debentures. This item should go to the credit side. Liability will be credited. The income or gain or profit, I said these items should also be credited. Income include the net profit or gross profit. Discount received is an income. Discount received. Why discount allowed is an expenses. This discount you received from the suppliers is an income. Royalty received. Royalty received is an income, while royalty paid is an expense. Then commission received. Commission received is an income, while commission paid is an expenses. Then rental income. Rental income or rent received is an income, while rent paid is an expense. So then investment income. These are income. All the income should be credited to the trial balance. Then aside income, we have capital. I said capital should be credited. Capital should be credited. Part of the income, your sales is an income, while purchases is an expense. Sales is an income, while purchase is an expense. All this one goes to credit side. We have the capital, the money used to start the business. The capital should also go to the credit side. So all these items will be credited to the trial balance. Other items that will also be credited is number one. Remember, any estimate against the items to be debited, that estimate in respect of that item should be credited. Remember, an asset like motor vehicle, land and building, they are assets. All those assets takes a debit entry in the trial balance. Any estimates you make against them will be credited. Like accumulated depreciation. Accumulated depreciation is an estimate. Accumulated depreciation, which is made against, maybe it could be on land and building, or it could be on plant and machinery, or furnitures and fittings. Accumulated depreciation is an estimate made against those assets. Since it is an estimate against the asset that takes a debit entry, so that estimate goes to the credit side. Then provision for bad debts or allowance for receivable. Allowance for receivables or provision for bad debts. Provision for bad debts is an estimate made against the receivables. Receivables is an asset which is taking a debit entry in the trial balance. Therefore, an estimate made against the receivable which is taking a debit entry will now go to credit side of the trial balance. Then, provision for debtors discount is also an estimate made against your debtors, that is your receivable. Remember, debtors or receivable is an asset. Since this is an estimate made against that, that estimate will be credited to the trial balance. Then your creditors discount. No, I've told you that this item should be credited. Why the one that will be debited now? Debit. Any provisions or estimate made against an item to be credited, that estimate will be debited. Remember, payable or creditors is a liability which goes to the credit side of the trial balance. Any estimate made against the creditors that takes a credit entry in the trial balance, that estimate goes to debit side. So we debit provision for creditors discount. This is an estimate made against creditors. Creditors is a credit entry in the trial balance. An estimate made against that creditors goes to the debit side of the trial balance. So these are the rules you have to bear in mind. The rules for extracting a trial balance. I want to give you the format for extracting the trial balance. Now, the format. You put the name of the entity, XYZ Limited, then trial balance as at December 31st, 20XX. So you have to use the period in the question. Your trial balance, we are going to have both the debit and the credit side. Debit and credit side. Remember, I've told you that all assets and expenses should be debited. Why? All liabilities, income and equity, I said they should be credited. Income is part of equity. Number one, we have capital. Capital is an equity, therefore it should be credited. If it is company, you are going to have ordinary shares, you are going to have retained earnings, you are going to have reserves as part of your equity. But I want to assume a sole trader format. That is why I'm putting capital. Net profit brought forward. Net profit is an income and it is part of equity. It should therefore be credited. Then you may have assets such as cash in hands. Cash you have in hands is an asset. An asset should take a debit entry in the trial balance. Cash at bank is an asset. The money you have at the bank is an asset. An asset should take a debit entry. Trade receivables. Trade receivables is an asset. I've told you, you may have it as debtors. Debtors, trade debtors. Trade receivables or trade debtors is an asset. That is, someone is owing you. The amount the person is owing you, that means your property is in the hands of that person. Therefore, it should take a debit entry. An asset should be debited. Allowances. Allowances for trade receivables or provision for bad and doubtful debts. Any provisions made against a debit balance, that provision will take a credit entry. Or provision made against a credit balance, that provision will take a debit entry. Trade receivables is an asset. And provision made and the trade receivable is taking a debit entry. Therefore, provisions made against that trade receivables will therefore take a credit entry. So you credit the allowances for trade receivables. Plant and machinery. Plant and machinery is your property. It's an asset. An asset should take a debit entry. Now, accumulated depreciation on plant and machinery. This is a provision made against plant and machinery that has received a debit entry. Therefore, that provisions will take a credit entry. Remember, I've told you that provisions made against the debit balance will take a credit entry. Now, motor vehicles. Motor vehicles is an asset. Motor vehicle is an asset. It will take a debit entry. Accumulated depreciation on motor vehicles. The provision for depreciation now, since motor vehicle is a debit entry, provision made against that will take a credit entry in the trial balance. Furniture and fittings, or features and fittings. Furniture and fittings is an asset. An asset should take a debit entry. So if you now have provisions made against it now, accumulated depreciation on furnitures and fittings, provision made against furnitures and fittings, which is a debit entry, that provision will take a credit entry. Now, then, land and building is an asset. Land and building, an asset, it will take a debit entry. Accumulated depreciation on land and building, it will take a credit entry. Then, computers, equipment is an asset. Accumulated depreciation on computer equipment will take a credit entry. Then prepaid expenses or payment in advance is an asset. Being an asset, it will take a credit entry. Accrued expenses or accruals. Accrued expenses is a liability. Being a liability, it will take a credit entry. Bank overdraft is a liability. Bank overdraft is a liability, it will take a credit entry. Bank loans is a liability. Being a liability, it will take a credit entry. Interest on loans is a provision made against loans itself. Loans is taking a credit entry. Therefore, provision made against credit entry, it goes to debit side of the trial balance. And besides, interest on loans is an expense. Interest on bank overdraft. Remember, bank overdraft is said takes a credit entry. Provision made against that takes a debit entry. And besides, interest on bank overdraft is an expense. An expense should take a debit entry. Then, lighting and heating is an expense. Expenses should take a debit entry. Wages and salaries is an expense. It will take a debit entry. Insurance is an expense. It will take a debit entry. Then bad debts written off is an expense. It will take a debit entry. Then we also have trade Payables or trade creditors. Creditors is a liability. Therefore, it will take a credit entry. Discount allowed. Discount allowed. You are given discount as an allowance to customers for prompt payment. When you sell, you are given this discount against sales. Therefore, you debit it. It's an expense. Discount received. Discount received. You are receiving this from the suppliers. Therefore, it is an income. It will therefore be credited. Purchases. Purchases is an expense. It should therefore be debited. Sales or revenue. This is an income. Being an income, it should therefore be credited. Carriage outwards. Carriage outwards. Carriage outwards is an expense. It should be debited. Carriage inwards. Carriage inwards is also an expense. It should be debited. Return inwards. This from your sales. Remember, you are crediting your sales. When customer return part of the goods you have sold to you, you will debit your return inwards. Return outwards. This should be credited. When you return part of the goods purchased to the suppliers, remember, purchases is taking a debit entry, and you return part of that goods you have bought to the suppliers, that will lead to reduction in purchase. That is why your return outwards should be credited. So you should not confuse return inwards and return outwards with carriage inwards and carriage outwards. Both carriage inwards and carriage outwards are expense. Since both are expense, they should therefore be debited to the trial balance. So every other expenses, every other assets, every other expenses and assets should be debited. And all other income, like rent received. Rent received is an income. It should be credited. Commission received is also an income. It should be credited. So then any other expenses should be debited. Liabilities will be mentioned of trade payables. I think that has been considered. It was credited. All liabilities should be credited. All income and equity should be credited, while all assets and expenses should be debited. So upon this, you debit. You sum up all your debit side, and you as well sum up the credit side to have the total. The debit side must agree with the credit side. So that is the format for extracting a trial balance. So I therefore want to take a work example. Example: the following balances were extracted from the books of Ezekiel Academy as at December 31st, 2022. Trade receivables of 2,034 naira. Inventories 5,466. Cash in hand 180. Revenue 11,132 naira. Rent 130. Power and heating 900 naira. External charges 27 naira. Rent received from space sublet 80 naira. Audit fees 300 naira. Pension cost 350 naira. Wages 300 naira. Purchases 8,000 naira. Insurance 500 naira. Salaries 150 naira. Interest on loans 200 naira. Loan 20,000 naira. Sundry expenses 300 naira. Income from investment 120 naira. Bank 350 naira. Discount allowed 220 naira. Discount receipt 280 naira. Motor vehicles 3,000 naira. Accumulated depreciation of motor vehicles 600 naira. Bank overdraft 500 naira. Investment at cost 5,000 naira. Plant and machinery 7,000 naira. Accumulated depreciation of plant and machinery 1,400 naira. Interest on overdraft 40 naira. Commission received 800 naira. Allowances for receivables 134 naira. Trade payables 6,000 naira. Computer equipment 7,500 naira. Accumulated depreciation on computer equipment 500 naira. Repairs 900 naira. Electricity 620. Stationery 400 naira. Interest receipt 730. Net profit brought forward 10,000 naira. Land 30,000. Capital 21,591 naira. You are required to extract the trial balance of AZ Khan Academy as at December 31st, 2020. Now that is the question. So now the solution. Solution. The name of the entity is AZ Khan Academy. Trial balance. Trial balance as at December 31st, 22x. So in trial balance, we are going to have the debit side and credit side. Amount in naira. Remember, I've told you that all expenses should be debited, while income, liability, and equity should be credited. Assets should be debited as well. Expenses and assets should be debited, while income, liabilities, and equity should be credited. Now, back to the question. Trade receivables 2,034. Trade receivables is an asset. An asset should take a debit entry. So we debit the trial balance. Trade receivables 2,034. Then back to the question. We have inventories. Inventories is an asset. We have 5,466. An asset should they take a debit entry. So we have inventories, assets. Therefore, it should be debited. 5,466. Back to the question. After inventories, the next item is cash in hands. And that amounted to 180. The cash you have in hands is also an asset. An asset should be debited. So we have cash in hands. Cash in hands of 180. Back to the question. We have revenue 11,132. Revenue is an income. Therefore, it should be credited. We have revenue 11,132. Revenue is an income. Therefore, it should be credited. We have rent. Rent paid is an expenses, while rent received is an income. Therefore, rent, when you are given rent, that means rent paid of 130. Therefore, it should be debited since it is an expenses. We have rent of 130. Rent of 130. Back to the question. After rent, the next item is power and heating of 900. Power and heating is an expenses. Therefore, it should be debited. Power and heating, and that amounted to 900, is an expenses. It should therefore be debited. After power and heating, the next item is external charges. Charges is an outflows of benefits. So charges is an expenses. External charges 27. What was charged by an external party against the organization is an expenses, 27 naira. Therefore, it should be debited. External charges of 27 naira. Back to the question. After external charges, the next item is rent received from space sublet. That amounted to 80 naira. Rent received, since it is received, is not rent paid. Rent received. Received is an inflows. Therefore, is an income to the entity. Therefore, income should be credited. So we have rent received. Rent received of 80 naira, and that is an income. So it should therefore be credited. Back to the question. After rent received, the next item is audit fees. Amount charged by an auditor for the service rendered. So for audit, this is audit fee. Audit fee is an expenses. That amounted to 300 naira. Audit fees of 300 naira is an expenses, so it should be debited. Then pension cost. Pension cost is an expenses. It's a payment. It's an expenses. It should therefore be debited. So we have pension cost of 350 naira. Pension cost of 350. Then after pension cost, then the next item is wages. Wages is an expenses. Wages paid. You pay for salaries. You pay for wages. So wages is an expenses. It should be debited. So we have wages. Expenses should be paid for. Wages of 300 naira. Then after wages, the next item is purchases. Purchases of 8,000 naira. Purchases of 8,000 naira. Purchases of 8,000 naira. Purchases is an expenses. That is why it should be debited as well. After purchases, the next item is insurance. Insurance is an expenses as well. Being an expenses, it should therefore be debited. Insurance. Insurance of 500 naira. It should be debited. Back to the question. After insurance, the next item is salaries. Salaries, the payment for salary is also an expense of the business. Therefore, it should be debited. Salaries of 150. Salaries, and that amounted to 150. Should be debited. After salaries, the next item is interest on loans of 200 naira. Interest on loans is an expense of the business. Therefore, it should be debited. Interest on loans. Interest on loans of 200 naira. An expense, it should be debited. Back to the question. After interest on loans of 200 naira, the next item is loans of 20,000 naira. Loans is a liability to the business. Being a liability should take a credit entry. Therefore, we credit the trial balance. Loans of 20,000 is a liability, and I've said that liability should be credited. After loans of 20,000, we have sundry expenses of 300 naira. This is an expense. An expense should take a debit entry. Therefore, we are going to debit the trial balance. Sundry expenses of 300 naira. After sundry expenses, the next item is income from investment of 120. Income from investment. This is an income. An income should take a credit entry in the trial balance. Therefore, we have income from investment. Income from investment, and that amounted to 120. I say income should be credited. Remember, in accordance with the rule, I said assets and expenses should be debited, while liability, income, and equity should be credited. Back to the question. Then we have bank. The money you have at the bank is your property. Therefore, is an asset to the business. So the money at the bank is an asset. An asset should be debited. So we have bank, and the amount involved is 350. So after bank of 350, we have discount allowed. This is an allowance given to the customers. Allowance given to the customers for prompt payment. This is an expense of the business, and that amounted to 220. Discount allowed. Discount allowed. An expense of 220. After discount allowed, back to the question. The next item is discount received of 280. The discount you received from the suppliers. The discount received from the suppliers is an income to the business. Being an income, it should therefore be credited. Therefore, you credit your trial balance. Discount received of 280. I said this is an income. And I've told you that an income should be credited. After discount received of 280, the next item is motor vehicles of 3,000 naira. Motor vehicles is a property of the business. And I've told you that the business properties are said to be an asset to the business. Being a property to the business, it should therefore be recognized as an asset. So an asset should be debited. So motor vehicles of 3,000 should be debited. So motor vehicles of 3,000 naira, that will be debited. After motor vehicles, we have accumulated depreciation of motor vehicles of 600. Now, a depreciation is an allowance against these motor vehicles. Since motor vehicle itself is taking a debit entry, any provision made against an item that takes a debit entry, that provision will be credited. So we have accumulated depreciation of motor vehicles. Provision made against a debit item should be credited. That provision is 600. So you credit it. Back to the question. After accumulated depreciation of motor vehicles, the next item is bank overdraft. You have overdrawn your bank account. That means you are owing the bank to the tune of the amount you have overdrawn. Therefore, bank overdraft is a liability. Being a liability, it should therefore be credited. Bank overdraft. Bank overdraft. The amount involved is 500 naira. So we credit it. Bank overdraft is, we take a credit entry. Back to the question. After the bank overdraft, the next item is investment at cost. The investment you make with other entity is your property in their hands. Being your property is an asset. An asset should take a debit entry. So we debit investment account with 5,000. So we have investment. Investment, that is at cost. That amounted to 5,000 naira. Back to the question. After investment, the next item is plant and machinery of 7,000 naira. Plant and machinery is your property. Therefore, is an asset. An asset should take a debit entry. Therefore, we debit the trial balance with 7,000 naira. Plant and machinery. Plant and machinery of 7,000 naira, an asset. Back to the question. After plant and machinery of 7,000 naira, the next item is accumulated depreciation on plant and machinery. That amounted to 1,400. Accumulated depreciation is a provision made against the plant and machinery. And I've told you that any provision made against the debit item, that provision should be credited to the trial balance. So we have accumulated depreciation on plant and machinery. Accumulated depreciation on plant and machinery, that amounted to 1,400. 1,400. Back to the question. After accumulated depreciation on plant and machinery, the next item is interest on overdraft of 40. Interest on overdraft is an expense of the business, therefore it should be credited. Interest on overdraft, and that amounted to 40 naira. Back to the question. Commission received. The commission you receive is an income to you. An income should be credited. Therefore, commission received, and that amounted to 800 naira. Commission received is amounted to 800. Back to the question. After commission received of 800 naira, the next item is allowances for receivables. Remember, receivable itself is our debtors, is a debit entry. And I've told you that provision made against the debit items should be credited. Therefore, allowances for receivables. Since receivable will be debited, therefore allowances made against that receivables should be credited. So 134. 134. 134. After allowances for receivables of 134, the next item is trade payables of 6,000. Trade payables is a liability to the business. That is your creditor, trade creditors. Trade payables is a liability. Being a liability, Therefore, you should take a credit entry in the trial balance. The amount involved is 6,000 naira. So trade payables, I've told you it's a liability. Being a liability, it should be credited. It should be credited. After trade payables, the next item is computer equipment of 7,500. Computer equipment is your property, therefore it's an asset of the business. Computer equipment of 7,500 naira. After computer equipment, the next item is accumulated depreciation on computer equipment, 500. So accumulated depreciation, remember computer equipment is a debit entry. Accumulated depreciation on computer equipment is a provision made against computer equipment that has received a debit entry in the trial balance. Therefore, that accumulated depreciation will be credited. Accumulated depreciation on computer equipment. The accumulated depreciation will be credited, 500. After accumulated depreciation on computer equipment of 500, we have repairs of 900. Repairs is an expenses. Therefore, it should be debited. Repairs, and the amount involved is 900. After repairs, we have electricity. The money you pay for electricity is also an expenses of the business. Therefore, it should be debited, 620. Electricity of 620. After electricity, we have stationery of 400. Stationery is also an expenses. It should therefore be debited. Stationery, and the amount involved is 400. Then we also have interest received. You are receiving this as an interest, not interest paid. Interest paid is an expense, but the interest received is an income to the business. Being an income, it should be credited. The amount involved is 730. Interest received, an income, it should be credited, 730. After interest received of 730, we have net profit brought forward of 10,000. Net profit is an income, so it should be credited. Net profit brought forward, the amount involved is 10,000. After net profit, we have land of 30,000. Land is a property of the business. So property is an asset, so you debit it. Land of 30,000. So it should be debited. After land, the next item is capital, 21,591. Capital is an equity. And I've told you that income, liabilities, and equity should be credited. So you credit your trial balance with 21,591. Capital 21,591. 21,591. So, having posted all the items to the trial balance, the next thing is to balance the trial balance by summing up the debit and the credit side of the trial balance. Now, let's do it. The debit side now, we have 2,034 plus 5,466 plus 180 plus 130 plus 900 plus 27 plus 300 plus 350 plus 300 plus 8,000 plus 500 plus 150 plus 200 plus 300 plus 350 plus 220 plus 3,000 plus 5,000 plus 7,000. Then plus 40 plus 7,500 plus 900 plus 620 plus 400 plus 30,000. The debit side is totaled 73,867. Now, let's sum up the credit side. We have 11,132 plus 80 plus 20,000 plus 120 plus 280 plus 600 plus 500 plus 1,400 plus 800 plus 134 plus 6,000 plus 500 plus 730 plus 10,000 plus 21,591. The credit side is total 73,867. 73,867. You will see that the debit side agrees with the credit side. That is the end of the solution, end of the work example on trial balance. The next question or the next lecture shall cover those other videos or topics not yet examined. Thanks for watching. Easy.